Hi, everybody. Welcome to Special Education Thursday, where we're going to be talking social skills with one of the best experts in town. Monica Adler Werner is the current Program Director for Development, Training, and Consultation at the Ivy Mount School. She's also the co-author of Unstuck and On Target. And quite frankly, she's one of my favorite people to talk about students with autism and developmental disabilities and social skills. As I said, we like to delve into a topic within special education and talk about it as parents. If you've joined us before, you know I frequently interrupt our speakers and say, can you please explain this in parent speak? So this is 30 minutes to give you a little nugget about our topic. And without further ado, because she's always got a lot to share and very, very knowledgeable, I'd love to welcome our guest, Monica, and ask her to tell us a little bit about how she's come to this position and this area of special education, and give us a little window into your background, Monica.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I had come to this from the approach that there are many different forms of intelligence and skills that are necessary in order to be successful in life. And we tend to put a lot of emphasis on academic achievement in children. And yet what repeatedly we find, study after study finds, is that actually social emotional skills are as important, if not more important at times, than academic skills. And I think this idea is gaining a lot of currency over the past 10 or 15 years. So I come at this, I was very interested in this idea of social emotional learning about 20 years ago, and became particularly interested in students that were being bullied and teased in schools, and especially trying to figure out what made them the targets for bullies. And it turned out that one of the common denominators for many children that were struggling in school was that they were struggling with their social skills. So I actually also have a deep interest in autism, and it goes without saying that autism is a communication disorder with a large area of need in the realm of social emotional development. And what really is the core of that issue is that people with autism who are very empathetic, kind, social people don't have the neurotypical social skills that are expected in order to be successful in the world. So while all of us who live and work with children with autism know that they're wonderful people, what they lack is the ability to successfully communicate how terrific they are to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is a pretty rigid and unforgiving place. So that's how I got interested in giving children and young adults access to the code that the world has for children, that has for people in how to interact socially, so that children and young adults and people with autism could reach their goals.
So, Monica, let's talk about, and specifically your background and work is with students with autism, but why, clearly, I think this is stating it correctly, it's so important to have social skills instruction for students with disabilities because of that bullying factor, because of that inability to navigate, the real world and society. But, what does it look like when students have pretty significant deficits in this area?
Well, what it looks like is that they're really struggling with their peers. They're struggling with basic kind of back and forth conversation, reciprocal conversation. They're struggling with getting the cues right. So they may laugh at times that are inappropriate, or they may say things that are off base. One of the real ways that I see that I think is really illustrative of of how compassionate our kids are is that a child might get hurt on the playground, and they'll go over to the child and say, "What happened?" Now, that's not a neurotypical response, right?
Uh-huh.
A neurotypical response is, "Are you okay?
Right.
How can I help?"
Yeah.
But our kids want to understand what happened so they can help.
Gotcha. And
And
so,
yet it's misread as, kind of asking for something that isn't needed at the time.
yeah, I think that's
So
a
I think,
that's a great example, because I think that one of the things that we like to do with this session is these terms are frequently bantered about in schools right now, and parents are like, okay, social skills, but why is that a problem, and what does it look like, and why is it just not being polite or being able to navigate? So do you want to, I've got your first slide in here about making the implicit explicit, and I'd love for you to talk about this, because I think that you make it so clear why this is such a key educational piece for kids with disabilities.
well, I think this is kind of my mantra for everything that I'm doing. So making the implicit, looking at your assumptions from the very beginning is really important, because if you don't go back to basics, you don't really know what to teach and how to teach it. So the first thing you want to look at is what are the origins of the social skills deficit you're dealing with it? Is it actually as an autism, a social cognition challenge? Or is it caused by anxiety, right? Is this an anxiety disorder? Or is it that the child is super, super impulsive and isn't stopping long enough to read the social cues? So they're able to see the social cues if they would just pause, but they don't pause. So you teach differently to all three different groups of those children.
Right.
And I think then what happens is, once you've figured out what the issue is, you have to teach things directly. So just because you taught it once, or you think they should know, and in my watchword there is, anytime you hear yourself saying should, you have to pause and say, wait a minute. If they could do it, they probably would do it. So you have to teach over and over again directly very specific skills and break them down to their smallest portion. And once you start to look at all of the implicit elements of basic social interaction, notice the next time you go to greet somebody, notice how many rules there are about how you greet that person that are contingent on things like, are they your boss or are they your friend? Do you like them? Do you not like them? Where do you look? What's your tone of voice? What kinds of things do you say? They're very complicated rules that the social world is governed by, that we need to make explicit for some children that don't understand those rules. And then in the case of autism or social cognition deficits, so that they're having trouble actually perceiving what the cue coming at them is, we have to teach directly, how do you tell what the situation is? Yeah.
And then tell me about, I know that you have experience in different kinds of classrooms, but how does, and we know that at a school like IVMet, that social skills piece is really big in the classroom, but how can this look in like an inclusion classroom?
Well, I think it starts with not assuming that the kid is being a jerk, right? And not assuming that the child has been put on the face of the earth to be miserable to you. And really understanding that this is an area of deficit that needs to be taught to. So the metaphor I always use is that I think on this domain where we were with dyslexia 50 years ago, which was in dyslexia, if you couldn't read, it's because you weren't trying hard enough, right? And if you didn't do it, then you were stupid, in quotes, right? So what I think what it looks like in the mainstream classroom is first an assumption that teachers and at home, we as parents, that we need to go into our teaching and coaching roles. And so when a child does something like that, rather than assuming they're willfully doing something that is inappropriate, you have to teach them what to do in that situation. So let's say, for example, a child takes a piece of paper from the teacher in a snappish way and doesn't say thank you when they're handing papers out. The teacher might really quietly say, let me show you what the best way to take a piece of paper from a teacher is, that makes them think about what an eager student you are, because I'm sure you took that paper because you were just eager to get started on the work.
Right, right. In some ways, it's similar to the cultural competence conversations that are going on, understanding what kids are coming with and what they're not coming with.
Well, I think that's a really actually apt way of thinking about it, Molly, because what really, as the autism self-advocacy movement grows, one of the things that they're arguing is that it's that, there's neurotypical social culture, and they have a different way of seeing the world that doesn't conform to that neurotypical social culture.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting for us as neurotypicals to think about why we get our nose so out of joint when somebody does something like grabs a piece of paper instead of takes it, politely smiles and says, thank you, teacher.
Right.
So I think you're dead on. That's exactly what it is.
So I just went back to your next slide. And as I told you, 30 minutes goes fast. We could probably, you and I could talk for 8 hours on this. But you've got the slide about what are social skills. So can you go over these 3 areas?
Yeah, so social skills are really complex, and I have to say, it's an overused term. I don't really love it as a term, but it is out there. So I tend to think of, what are the elements of social competency, right? How can we make people socially competent? And the first one is sort of those basic instrumental skills. So that's a piece of paper, that's greeting people, that's, all of the basic, how you get through life skills, table manners fall into that. There's more complex, though, which is a term that you've heard me use already, which is this idea of social cognition, which is that understanding and seeing the social world and perceiving the social cues that are coming at you accurately, and then being able to respond in ways that are expected by neurotypical people. And you can already you hear the complexity of that explanation. So we could go back to the child who's asking what happened when his friend is on the playground, because he's struggling to put together all of the elements of what happened in what was probably a very fast social interaction, and doesn't really know what cue to look for. So he's actually genuinely asking you to cue him into what does he need to do? Mm-hmm. I fell down. Can you help me stand up? And it's because if you see it for the act of generosity that it is, the social it's because he's missed very important social cues. So we would never be upset with a blind person for tripping over a curb, right? Right.
And I think just real quick, for those of people who've been on our, especially on Thursday before, we had Dr. Laura Kenworthy talking about executive functioning skills, and we talked about the can't, not, won't, and that really emphasizes again what you're saying about is it, should or could, but also that if you look at these as like they can't do it, not a won't do it, how do we as the adults in the room, whether you're a teacher or parent, how do we teach them this?
Exactly. And I think that's what we're always thinking about. If you put these things in the can't category, not the won't, we go into a totally different way of interacting and thinking about problems. So the other thing is that our children, is that often you find in children with social difficulties that they tend to become pretty rigid. And that rigidity is adaptive, because rigidity in all of our lives brings predictability. You have a pretty good chance of knowing what's going to happen. If A, then B, then C. But it can also have a pretty significant impact on children. That rigidity can have an impact on people's ability to effectively problem solve and collaborate. And we wonder, so that is another domain that I think is really important. And Dr. Kenworthy, I'm sure, talked about this when she was discussing executive function deficits, but the importance of teaching children and young adults how to problem solve systematically, so that we're not just saying, you're rigid, you're stuck, therefore you're bad, but rather that we're teaching, because it's a can't at that moment, how do we help them become more flexible problem solvers?
Right.
And those are for me the big domains that you have to teach.
Mm-hmm. And then, before we get into the teaching piece, can you talk a little bit about, and again, I think we all feel like social skills, the way it's being used and overused in education is kind of difficult, but what would IEP goals in this area look like? I mean, what?
Well, I think it's the classic example. They would look like they have to be very specific and broken down. It shouldn't, I think the danger of the IEP goals that I see from this is that Bobby will be able to work effectively with a large group of children.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so it's the usual SMART goal stuff. But more importantly, I think you start with the givens. And you have to remember that, your first year you're working on a social skill. The givens are going to be with adult support in a therapeutic setting, right? In a small group, right? You're going to really break things down. And then your objectives are going to be very specific. So it's going to start with, let's say we're working on a group project as a goal, right? You're going to start out very specifically, right? Given adult support and a checklist, Sammy will be able to participate in a small group of no more than 3 students, right? And then your objectives would follow from that very specifically. So first that you would, Bobby will see how the work is going to be divided, right? And you'll work through each of the objectives, slowly fading back support. But your investment in doing this slowly and systematically pays off in spades, because as you develop success in achieving these goals, everybody feels a sense of accomplishment and competency, so that you then get better at generalizing how to scaffold other social situations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one well-constructed social skills goal can be an inspiration to a lot of other situations.
Wow. And then who do you see that with these kinds of goals, it's generally the special ed teacher working on it, or does it fall in speech therapy or, related services, or, kind of where would parents kind of see this if they were looking at an IEP or this was being talked about?
Well, I think unfortunately, all too often, I see these goals as falling in speech and language therapy, or sometimes it's the mental health provider in the school. And it really should be a joint goal between the teacher and the special education and the related service provider. Because these goals, this actually really gets to the next slide, Molly, which is this idea that if you're going to get effective intervention, you have to work on the generalization. So while you may work on the objective first in a therapeutic setting, it's not worth anything if you're not practicing those skills all of the time in a general education setting with a supportive special education or general education teacher who understands what the related service provider has been teaching.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a really good point. So I want to reiterate it for any parents or professionals that are working, that these kinds of goals cannot just be lumped into a mental health goal or a speech therapist goal, that it really does have the generalization for need for social skills pieces has to be in that, that team aspect for the goals. So that's something that parents could really look at and really talk about at their IEP meeting.
And, I think, Molly, this is where it's the model that we worked on in Unstuck, which is first you do direct instruction of a skill, right, so that you get it really modeled down, and you tell the parents and the teacher what exactly you were working on right there. Because the power of that synergy of everyone pulling in the same direction is really extraordinary. And once again, success breeds success. Everybody feels better. Right? Teachers don't like feeling ineffective. Children don't like feeling ineffective. Parents don't like feeling ineffective.
Right. And what I love about your slide here about the generalizing too is that, it's really those teeny tangibles. As you said, we're starting small and it's going to kind of broad, but prioritizing and like, okay, we're going to work on, even if it's a politeness piece, or we're going to work on an appropriate response from the student when they're frustrated or when they read, and then that can generalize elsewhere onto the playground, into the cafeteria, in the hallways, things like that.
Right, and I would encourage, it's so, even though what we just said, we as people who work all the time, you want to celebrate small successes. So you don't want to say, oh, we're working on making him polite. Rather, we're working on Susie saying please 50% of the time when she asks for something.
Yeah.
And then what happens is that when you get that, celebrate that success. Mm-hmm. Rather than focusing on the 50% of the time she didn't do it, focus on the 50% of the time she did do it.
And if I could just add, one of the things that I've picked up along the way is, can you share about your kind of philosophy or saying about the numbers of times you should praise versus the number of times criticize?
Oh, well, that's the classic sort of, there's been a million studies about what's the praise to correction ratio you need to have. And at one point, it was as high as 10 praises for every correction. I think statistically it's 4 to 1. But right. I think it's really important because I think about, every time, and just think about in our own lives, when you get criticized, it takes a lot to build you back up again, even if it's a small thing, a small correction, right? I even, your hair is kind of a mess. And then you are kind of looking for someone to say, oh, I love the way your shirt looks, or really silly things like that. Notice how important it is to have a good bank of praise, of supportive comments, and so that when you do get corrected, you've got a well to pull on. And this is especially true for children that are struggling with social emotional learning. They are criticized a lot, and it's actually relentless. And, going back to our dyslexia metaphor, Molly, nobody asks the dyslexic child to read all day complicated books. And yet children with social emotional learning challenges are being asked to constantly perform in their area of greatest difficulty.
And something that I would love to share too, having two children with autism, is for parents and teachers to realize how exhausting it is to be in school all day when you have social skills deficits and ability. And I have found that I don't really talk to my kids when they come home right away, because they have just done the hardest things to their body and their minds for 8 hours. And they really do need a break, and they need to resurge. And I think for parents and teachers to understand how challenging it is to even, when they are doing it, it's tilting your iceberg, and you're exhausting yourself all day.
Right. And I think it really is, it's going back to the can't versus the won't. If you start to think about somebody as working on something that's a can't, you suddenly start to appreciate how successful they are. So people talk to me about how rigid their child is, and the first thing I do is ask them to give me some examples of when they've been flexible. And, this is a pretty powerful exercise for us to all engage in, because it turns out that people are even people who are rigid, in quotes, are much more flexible than we appreciate. They're just not as flexible as we would like them to be at the moment we want them to be.
Right. Because we're getting close to the end and I want to get to your resources. What do you wish, I'm going to ask you two questions, same question, different talk. What do you wish parents knew about this area? And then the flip, what do you wish teachers knew about this area? What would be the thing that you would share with both of those groups?
Well, I know it sounds trite, but I think the first thing is thinking about this as teachers and educators, not as judges and juries. I think it's really important that we realize that this is something that we need to teach. And it can feel overwhelming because when you go to teacher school, right, or you go to parent school, you don't learn about how to teach social emotional learning skills.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I would do is give people permission to know that this is hard and you don't know how to do it well. And once you forgive that and give yourself that space, you open up the space to go out and learn how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really understanding that this is that if you start thinking about asking the question, like all good coaches, what do I need to teach here? You get into a very powerful place. And I think it brings all of us as parents or teachers back to the place we want to be in, which is a supportive, empathetic place rather than a frustrated, angry place.
Mm-hmm. That's really great. So we're in the last few minutes, Monica, I'm at the resources. And for those of you who've joined us with Special Ed Thursdays before, you know we always end with the speaker sharing 2 or 3 places you can go for a little bit more information. As I've said to people, I've gone through a lot of parent trainings and special ed trainings over my 15 years of being in this world. And lots of times you're inundated with huge bibliographies and resources. And sometimes I always wanted people to just tell me, give me 1 or 2 other places I can noodle around and find more. So Monica shared 3 with us. And the first is CASEL. I'm not even sure what CASEL stands for, but I know it's an organization, focused on social and emotional learning. But why did you choose that, Monica?
So what I think is important about CASEL is they've been in the vanguard of promoting social emotional learning. And they actually now are collaborating with the new chancellor of DC Public Schools for bringing social emotional learning into DC Public Schools, because the evidence is clear. Children that are explicitly supported in their social emotional development, whether they're struggling with one of any of the areas that we're talking about, do better academically. And I just applaud the extraordinary work that they've done in a very short period of time on this.
That's great.
And they also have things like IEP goals. They've got a lot of resources on their website, so I would encourage you to go there.
That's great.
The second one is,
I just wanted to reiterate there are some sample IEP goals and what to look at, because I think that's something for parents and professionals to kind of have a sense of what this should look like.
So the other one is just an easy article in Psychology Today, but that I think brings things down really to its most basics and covers some of the ideas that we talked about today. And the third one, the reason I put this in was actually, Molly, for the IEP goal issue, is that in solving executive function challenges, simple ways to get kids with autism unstuck and on target, we have in there, we spent a lot of time working on sample IEP goals there. And we have a whole, I'd say, roughly 20% of the book is sample IEP goals for social emotional learning.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So,
put on the screen.
It's applicable to more than just children with autism, those goals. I really think they can be generalized to children that are struggling because of ADHD. And if they have anxiety disorders, it's the same concept.
That's great. And I put a picture of the book up. One of the things I'd love to share, especially for the parents and folks listening, is it's not a very big book. It's very accessible. It's really easy to get into, and it's not full of a lot of educational jargon that can be kind of challenging. And the link on our site right now is showing the Amazon page, but it's really, I think, very parent friendly, and people who want to delve into this on that kind of level.
Yeah, well, when we wrote it, we were always thinking about, we're all actually overworked parents as well, and we were thinking about what can you put on your nightstand and read in the 20 minutes before you fall asleep out of sheer exhaustion and actually get something out of it. So
I think you've spoken to a lot of parents on that.
Right.
Yeah, what else? We've got a minute or so, and then I want to plug for the 2 weeks from now, but any closing comments, Mom?
No, I just think I'm thrilled you're doing this. I think it's a really important issue, and because parents really are undersupported and really need an opportunity to learn about these terms that are being bandied about, right? As if we should all know what they are. And this is a complex area. So I'm thrilled that you're helping parents develop their competency and that we can figure out a way to work collaboratively and in supportive ways of the whole organization around children that are struggling.
And I think that, one of the reasons we did want to focus on it too is there's so much focus in today's schools and we do this specifically with a DC focus here, and there's a lot of issues on the PARCC testing and everything, but we focus so much on that academic and the grades piece, and these things are so pivotal to children growing into successful adults, and it has to have a presence in the classroom especially for our kids with disabilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And don't let people tell you that social emotional learning isn't directly linked to academic performance. That's what the CASEL website can do for you.
Oh, that's great. That's a really good point, because I think sometimes people fight for, like, we really need, this is a challenge and we're really scared of where our child is going, with this, without support. We thank you so much, Monica, and thanks everybody for joining. As I said, the recording will be on the AJE website by the end of today, hopefully. And we are going to have, in 2 weeks, we do Special Education Thursdays every other Thursday. And in 2 weeks, on September 21st, we're going to be having as our guest Julie Camerata, who's the Executive Director of the Special Education Cooperative in DC, and she works specifically with charters. And we're going to be talking about special education and charters and what parents need to know about public charters and special education. So that's going to be another fun conversation. And Monica, I may have to have you back for another topic. So just know I'll probably be asking. Thanks, everybody.
Always love talking to you, Molly.
All right. And we're going to end the recording right now. Thank you all.